March, Vladimir Putin will, in the loosest possible sense, face an election. The result isn't in doubt: a resounding victory, securing his iron grip over the Russian state. Were he to serve out his new 6-year term, he would be the longest-serving ruler of Russia since the 18th century. Indeed, Putin always seeks to project this image of continuity and stability with the great Russian past, despite the embarrassing turbulence of communism. Yet, is he as secure as he appears? Just how strong can any dictator be, especially one waging a war that has sent hundreds of thousands of one's citizens to their deaths? As we saw with the brief mutiny led by the recently deceased Wagner leader Yevgeny Prigozhin, even seemingly the strongest of regimes can be fragile to new threats, especially when a dictator is obliged to hand increased powers to others in times of war. It's also worth remembering that Putin is not a young man. At 71 years old, already he far exceeds the average age of a Russian male. Imagine, for a moment, if he were suddenly taken unwell, or obliged to hand over power due to ill health. What then? As such, it's very much worth contemplating who's waiting in the wings to take centre stage if such scenarios were to occur, just as Western intelligence agencies do. So let's take a closer look at the people who could one day replace Vladimir Putin. In the event of a Russian president's untimely death, the Russian constitution is clear. The Prime Minister steps up and becomes interim president before an election is held. Mishustin, the current PM, is the former head of the Federal Tax Service and is known as a no-nonsense, hard-line manager. He maintains a good relationship with Putin and seems, on the surface, like the perfect technocratic successor. Interestingly, Mishustin has done his best to distance himself from the special military operation. He's never visited the occupied Ukrainian territories and hasn't echoed any of Putin's Ukraine-destroying sentiment. What's less clear is what would happen if he were obliged to challenge his boss. Ultimately, he's a high-ranking former accountant. He's not a man of direct action, and certainly isn't versed in the arts of subterfuge and spycraft. Valentina Matvienko, chairwoman of the Federation Council. The highest-ranking woman in Vladimir Putin's government, Valentina Matvienko is in charge of the upper house of parliament which approved the Russian election date of March 17th. Rigidly loyal to Putin for many years and an ardent supporter of his war with Ukraine, despite her being born there, Matvienko could one day be next in line should Putin vacate his seat. Before Putin's rise to power, she was even encouraged to run for president. She has survived 50 years of political manoeuvring from the old Soviet Union to the Russian Federation in its current form. No mean feat. Her main stumbling block is more likely to be old-fashioned institutional sexism. The other major players simply may not accept operating under a female leader. Sergey Shu. The Russian defense minister has had a turbulent relationship with Putin due to the earlier military failures in Ukraine. So Mr. Shoigu isn't likely to be selected as a direct inheritor of the top job in Russian politics. Despite suffering several major political setbacks and being blamed for Russia's stalled invasion, Shoigu has remained in his elevated position as the head of his country's armed forces. He holds the unique position of being able to use brute force to assert power. Although many different moving parts would have to fall into place, his direct influence over Russia's armed forces mean he could, theoretically, execute a military coup should he convince enough military officials to shuffle over to his side. Despite his seniority though, his poor results in Ukraine would make recognition of his authority a serious challenge. We already know how an armed revolt turned out for another of Putin's former friends, Yevgeny Prigozhin. Dimitri Medvedev, deputy head of the Russian Security Council. One of Putin's key long-term enablers, Medvedev has a history of sharing power with and doggedly supporting his long-term ally and friend. Putin gave the presidency to Medvedev in 2008 in order to circumvent constitutional time limits that at the time still applied. Medvedev's proximity to Putin means that their two fates are intricately intertwined. Should Putin fall, Medvedev's influence will likely wane with him. His only realistic route back to the presidential hot seat would be if Putin needed to transfer power for a time. Medvedev is sometimes seen as a figure of fun in Russian politics due to his intense loyalty to his boss, fostering a reputation as his being a helpful lapdog, ranting and raving at all and sundry, rather than a respected political heavyweight. He would never run against his boss in an election, and certainly wouldn't orchestrate his downfall. When considering our next category, the outsiders, it's worth noting that the question of Putin's successor depends on the nature of his tenure ending. Sergey Sobyanin, mayor of Moscow. The respected mayor of Moscow, Sobyanin is a successful career politician who's worked across several important offices in Russia. He was credited with upgrading Moscow into a modern metropolis until the war broke out. Naturally, he is another Putin loyalist and once served the president as his chief of staff. Sobyanin is another senior politician who has limited his involvement in Ukraine, having also stayed well clear of the occupied territories and hasn't publicly endorsed the war. He wouldn't stand against Putin in an election, so his accession would most likely stem from an internal coup should the Russian government lose confidence in Putin due to rising civil unrest and/or his position becoming untenable. Sobyanin would represent a safe pair of hands to steady the ship. Nikolai or Dmitry Patrushev. This father-son duo represent a minor dynasty of power in Russian politics. The more senior of the two is seen by some as a possible successor to Putin, who he maintains a tight relationship with. His views are extreme, and he holds a particular disdain for the United States. His borderline wacky beliefs, which include historic allegations he employed mind readers to gather intelligence on Western dignitaries, could also count against him. His age, 71, and his proximity to Putin mean he would also probably only be a placeholder until a younger appointee could be installed. This brings us to his son, Dmitry. Although his chances are perhaps still fairly small, he is practically a spring chicken at 46, and his powerful connections could open significant doors. His current role as Minister of Agriculture puts him on the fringes, but a power-sharing arrangement with his father could be a very real route to success. The pair are known as the new nobility. Only time will tell how their story ends. And now we reach the least likely. The revolutionary, Boris Nadezhdin. Mr. Nadezhdin has promised to challenge Putin in the upcoming presidential election. Challenges to Putin's Kremlin don't last long. But Mr. Nadezhdin seems determined to throw his hat into the ring in 2024. A veteran politician, he objects to the war in Ukraine and has aired his concerns publicly at the undemocratic process currently being implemented. His protest may be symbolic, but it does show that there remains some visible opposition within Russia. He was also a close ally of murdered opposition politician Boris Nemtsov, who was assassinated in 2015. Nadezhdin has been careful not to break the censorship rules which prevent him from describing the invasion of Ukraine as a war. He said openly that he cannot speak candidly on the matter without fear of criminal reprisals. It's unclear what will happen when the election draws closer and whether he will be allowed to stand. So there we are, the most likely figures to succeed Putin were events to take a different course in the coming months or years. Yet if history teaches us anything, it is that nothing is predictable, and anyone can be killed. There is great nervousness in the West about what the end of a Putin regime would mean. They prefer the known quantity to the unknown. But Putin has proven himself a survivor, and a highly capable one at that. Instead of fearing a world without him, perhaps the West needs to think more seriously about building relations with those who might one day succeed him, just as it did with Mikhail Gorbachev. A new regime, after all, can rarely afford to countenance a costly foreign war. Just look at the Bolsheviks after they seized power in 1917. Their priority was to withdraw from the First World War. Lenin knew that was the only way the new regime would stand a chance. As the world, in short, becomes a more dangerous place, new leadership, not necessarily friendly to the West, but which needs to prioritise security at home rather than warfare abroad, may be a better option than one with Vladimir Putin still at the helm of the Russian state.